Picture a master bathroom in a new American home. 2 sinks, walk-in shower, soaking tub. And don't forget the toilet paper holder stacked 3 rolls high. Did you know that Americans spend $12 billion a year on toilet paper? The average American uses 57 sheets per day, more than any other nation on Earth. In Japan, over 80% of homes have a bidet. In Italy, it is legally required in every new residential build. In the United States, fewer than 5% of homes have one. The real question is not whether Americans know bidets exist. It's why every new home built in this country seems to make sure you can't use one. The answer is not culture. It's not squeamishness. It's not that Americans tried bidets and walked away. It's something buried in a document most people have never heard of, and it goes back further than you think. Let's start with the gap, not the cultural gap, the physical one. Under 5% of American homes contain a bidet, according to Statista and Tushy market data from 2022 and 2023. In Japan, Toto's own corporate data puts penetration above 80%. In South Korea and Argentina, bidet use is near universal. In France and Portugal, it is a standard fixture in most homes. And in Italy, a bidet has been legally required in every new residential construction since 1975, a mandate reinforced through the Decreto Ministeriale 37/2008 lineage. Italy doesn't ask home builders to consider it. Italy requires it. Meanwhile, Americans use 141 rolls of toilet paper per person per year. That is the highest consumption rate on the planet. And producing those rolls is not cheap on the environment. The Pacific Institute has calculated that manufacturing a single roll of toilet paper requires roughly 37 gallons of water. Using a bidet requires about 1/8 of a gallon. The math is not subtle, so the scale of the American outlier is real, measurable, and persistent. It spans decades. It survives generation after generation of new construction. And if this were simply a matter of personal preference, if Americans had simply decided, household by household, that they preferred paper, you would expect to see bidets in some new homes, in upscale homes, in health-conscious homes. You would expect the market to serve at least a meaningful minority. It does not. And that is the first thing that should feel strange. The obvious explanation is that Americans just never warmed to the idea. But that is not actually what happened. Here is what the obvious explanation misses. Americans did have bidets, and they were buying them. American Standard sold standalone bidet fixtures through the 1960s and into the 1970s. So did Crane Plumbing and Elger, all major American plumbing manufacturers, all offering the product through normal retail channels. The Sears catalog listed bidet fixtures in the 1970s. This was not a niche European import available only in specialty showrooms. It was a mainstream American plumbing product, sold alongside toilets and sinks in the same catalogs. Then, it disappeared. Understanding why requires understanding what a bidet actually demands from a home. A standalone bidet is not a gadget you plug in. It is a plumbing fixture. It needs its own drain connection, its own water supply line, and its own floor space, the same basic rough-in infrastructure that a toilet requires. You cannot add one to a finished American bathroom without opening the floor and walls. The rough-in must be there from the beginning, before the tile goes down, before the walls close. This is where production home builders enter the picture. Companies like Levitt & Sons, the firm that built Levittown, the template for post-war American suburban construction, standardized the American bathroom around a minimum fixture count: 1 toilet, 1 sink, 1 tub shower combination. That minimum became the industry norm. KB Home, Pulte, D.R. Horton, the largest American home builders by volume, all built to that same basic floor plan logic. Adding a bidet rough-in added cost per unit. At the scale of thousands of homes, builders made a simple calculation. No resale premium, no requirement, no rough-in. But that still sounds like builder cheapness. And builder cheapness alone does not explain why this kept happening for 70 years. The builders were following a logic, and the logic came from a document almost nobody reads. Dr. Evan Goldstein is a colorectal surgeon based in New York City, the founder of Future Method. In interviews published between 2021 and 2023, he has said something that sounds almost too direct for a medical professional. Toilet paper, used alone, does not clean. It smears, it irritates. It leaves residue on tissue that was not designed to tolerate repeated abrasion. The clinical consequences of this are not minor. Anal fissures, hemorrhoids, pruritus ani, chronic itching caused by incomplete fecal cleansing, affects an estimated 1 to 5% of the American population chronically, according to data from the American Society of Colon and Rectal Surgeons. For millions of Americans, that condition is a daily reality. And for a meaningful portion of those cases, the underlying cause is the same. The only hygiene tool available to them was inadequate. Rose George spent years documenting global sanitation. In The Big Necessity, published in 2008, she made a point that stayed largely unread in the US. America was the only wealthy nation in the world that treated bathroom hygiene infrastructure as a luxury item rather than a baseline public health provision. Every other developed country had arrived at the bidet through culture, through code, through medical consensus, and only America had somehow bypassed it entirely. For patients with inflammatory bowel disease, post-surgical recovery needs, or mobility limitations, the situation is not about comfort. Bidets are clinical recommendations for these populations. Toto developed the washlet, the first mass-market electronic bidet seat, launched in 1980, partly in response to Japanese geriatric hospital research on hygiene standards for post-operative patients. Then, March 2020 happened. The toilet paper ran out. Families across the country, named in real-time news coverage, were rationing rolls, driving between stores, posting photos of empty shelves. For a few weeks, the single fixture dependency was suddenly, visibly, undeniable. Millions of Americans searched bidet for the first time, and for a moment, it looked like the conversation was finally going to change. But doctors had known for years, patients had experienced it for years, and somewhere there were people who had studied this exact problem and decided nothing needed to change. The organization responsible for the plumbing standards that govern roughly 35 American states is the International Association of Plumbing and Mechanical Officials, IAPMO. It publishes the Uniform Plumbing Code, or UPC. The remaining states fall under the International Plumbing Code, the IPC, published by the International Code Council. These two documents define what a legal residential bathroom must contain. They establish the minimum fixture counts that builders must meet. And here is the fact that reframes everything. Neither the UPC nor the IPC has ever required a bidet rough-in for residential construction. Not once. Not in any edition. In both codes, the bidet is classified as an optional fixture. The first edition of the Uniform Plumbing Code was published in 1928. By that year, bidets were already in widespread residential use across Europe. The decision to classify them as optional, rather than mandatory, rather than even recommended, was not neutral. It was a decision with downstream consequences that compounded across every decade that followed. When a fixture is optional, production builders exclude it. The logic is automatic. No requirement means no rough-in. No rough-in means no drain, no supply line, no floor space reserved. And once the floor is tiled and the walls are closed, the absence is permanent without a gut renovation. Italy reached the opposite conclusion. Italian building code predecessors to the Decreto Ministeriale 37/2008 codified the bidet as a required fixture decades ago. The code minimum mandated the infrastructure. Builders built it because they had to. The result is 97% penetration, not because Italian consumers are more sophisticated, but because the code did not give builders the option to skip it. The IAPMO code development process runs on member voting. Voting participants are weighted toward plumbing contractors, manufacturers, and builders. Public health researchers are not a dominant voice. Hygiene specialists are not a dominant voice. The people who experience the clinical consequences of inadequate bathroom infrastructure are not a dominant voice. The code stayed as it was, and what locked the code in place was not public satisfaction with the outcome. Something else entirely kept the status quo in place. Here is where the financial logic becomes visible. The American tissue market generates $31 billion annually, according to Risi and Fisher International industry data. That number depends almost entirely on a single fixture bathroom. The moment a bidet enters the average American home, toilet paper consumption drops by an estimated 75 to 80% per household. The math of what wide bidet adoption would do to the tissue industry is not complicated. Scott Paper Company was founded in Philadelphia in 1879. It was the first company to mass-market toilet paper rolls in the United States, and over the following decades, it invested heavily in advertising campaigns, running through the 1930s and the 1940s, that built toilet paper into the unquestioned American hygiene standard. By the time most Americans were making post-war purchasing decisions, the alternative had been crowded out of the cultural frame entirely. INDA, the Association of the Non-Woven Fabrics Industry, represents tissue and wipes manufacturers and has a documented history of resisting regulatory action against its products. The American Forest and Paper Association lobbies on the tissue supply chain. No direct anti-bidet lobbying is publicly documented. None needs to be. The industry's interest was served simply by ensuring that the code never changed, that the cultural default held, and that the infrastructure was never built. And the person who could name this most precisely was not a journalist or a public health researcher. It was Toto. Toto USA has operated in the American market since 1989, more than 35 years. In that time, the company's own internal market research, cited repeatedly in trade press, consistently identified the same two barriers: no rough-in plumbing and no electrical outlet near the toilet. Not cultural resistance, not consumer ignorance, infrastructure. The house itself was the problem. The house was built to make the bidet impossible. That finding was not secret. Toto shared it publicly. It named the structural barrier in trade publications accessible to code committees, to builders, to industry associations. The bidet was absent from nursing school curricula, absent from hospital patient education materials, absent from residential construction training programs. The knowledge existed, the documentation existed, and nothing changed. Then, in the third week of March 2020, toilet paper disappeared from American store shelves. Tushy reported a 10-fold increase in sales inside a single week. Amazon bidet-related searches spiked 2,300%, according to Google Trends data from the week of March 15 through 22, 2020. Tushy, BioBidet, and Brondell all reported months-long backorder by April. For the first time in American consumer history, bidet products were genuinely sold out at scale. It looked like the moment. 70 years of infrastructure inertia and a 2-week toilet paper shortage had finally done what decades of medical evidence could not. American consumers were searching, buying, and installing. But the structural bottleneck did not move. To understand why, you have to go back to what Toto already knew. The company had been publishing its market research findings in American trade press for years. The barriers were not attitudinal, they were architectural. No outlet, no rough-in, no supply line. And that finding pointed directly at the two code documents, the UPC and the NEC, that IAPMO and the ICC controlled. Toto named the problem. The code committees had access to the same trade press. The information was not hidden. What was missing was any institutional mechanism that forced the codes to respond. IAPMO's member voting structure gave builders and contractors the dominant voice in the room. There was no public health mandate requiring the committee to weigh hygiene outcomes against construction cost savings. There was no federal agency with jurisdiction over residential fixture minimums. The Consumer Product Safety Commission does not regulate what builders are required to include. The CDC does not write plumbing codes. The gap between what the medical evidence said and what the code required was not anyone's formal responsibility to close. Most American bathrooms do not have a GFCI electrical outlet within reach of the toilet. The National Electrical Code, Section 2-10.52, does not require one. Every major electric bidet seat on the market requires a standard 120-volt outlet. The Toto Washlet, the Brondell Swash, the Bio Bidet Bliss. Without an outlet, none of them can be installed. Without a dedicated water supply line, a non-electric bidet attachment requires a T-valve retrofit that most American renters cannot perform and most landlords will not authorize. The 2020 demand surge produced real sales numbers, but it produced them in the accessory market, in bidet seat attachments, and portable sprayers and retrofit kits, not in new construction. Not one line of the Uniform Plumbing Code changed. Not one line of the National Electrical Code changed. The code committees met. The minimum fixture counts remained. The optional classification stayed optional. Consumers had voted with their wallets in a moment of panic, and the infrastructure had simply absorbed the vote without responding to it. The demand was there, the product existed, but the house itself was designed not to have it. Go back to that master bathroom. 2 sinks, walk-in shower, soaking tub, toilet, toilet paper holder, stacked 3 rolls high, no bidet, no outlet within reach of the toilet, no supply line for a second fixture. That room is not a neutral space. It is a document. It records the 1928 Uniform Plumbing Code decision to classify the bidet as optional. It records every production builder who ran the cost calculation and found the number was 0 because the code required nothing more. It records Scott Paper Company's decades of advertising that made one hygiene tool the only hygiene tool Americans could picture. It records an industry that had every financial reason to prefer the status quo and no legal obligation to change it. It records the National Electrical Code's silence on outlets near toilets and the IAPMO voting process that gave public health researchers no structural seat at the table. The Italian government made a different decision. In 1975, it determined that basic bathroom hygiene infrastructure was a public health floor, not a luxury, not an optional amenity, a baseline. It wrote that into code, and builders built it. And now, 97% of Italian homes contain the fixture that fewer than 5% of American homes have. That gap is not taste, it is policy. It is what happens when one government decides the minimum is not enough, and another government never asks the question at all. The United States did not decide against bidets. It simply never decided, which, compounded across 70 years of construction and code cycles, produces the same result as a decision. The toilet paper holder on the wall is not just a fixture. It is the endpoint of a 70-year infrastructure arrangement made by code writers, builders, and an industry that all agreed, without ever having to say it aloud, that this was enough.